Hey everybody, welcome back to History Student Reacts. Today we'll be watching Avenging Varus Part 2, The Campaigns of Germanicus. So, last time we saw the aftermath of the disastrous battle of the Teutoburg Forest. We saw Tiberius being sent to deal with these Germanic tribes, and we ended with Germanicus himself being sent in. We're going to see more of the campaigns of Germanicus in this episode. I'm very excited to get to it. If you guys end up enjoying this one, I would appreciate it if you would check out my Patreon, which is linked down below, and will give you access to exclusive reaction content. Anyway, with all of that out of the way, let's jump right into this video.
Following the cold winter of 14 AD, the northern lands of Germania began to look just a bit brighter with the thawing of spring.
Alright, 14 AD, and the Romans have already been at this for a couple of years. I mean, it's been a few years since the Battle of the Teutoburg Forest. Of course, Tiberius was recalled in 12 AD because Augustus was sick, and it was assumed that he would shortly have to take over the position of emperor, which was true. So already Rome's been at this for a while, but they have not yet dealt their full vengeance to these Germanic tribes.
Unfortunately, the same could not be said for the future prospects of the tribes beyond the Rhine.
Uh-oh.
The afterglow of their victory at Teutoburg had begun to wane in the face of Rome's vengeful wrath. In just a few years, the legions had carved a brutal swath through the frontier territories, burning, enslaving, massacring all in their path.
Yeah, I mean, look, we have the Battle of the Teutoburg Forest, and I don't want to downplay how significant it was. It was a serious psychological scar on Rome. And like I said, Rome would never substantially conquer beyond the Rhine. Now, there would be plenty of expeditions beyond the Rhine, but overall, if you look at a map of the Roman Empire, it generally stops at the Rhine River. So that is a very influential battle. But that's more a psychological thing. In practical terms, the Battle of the Teutoburg Forest didn't have to be that influential. It wasn't necessarily as big a deal as the Romans felt it was. I mean, look at this. That was one great victory for Arminius and these Germanic tribes, but now it's been a couple of years, and the Romans have already dealt quite a bit of damage against them, and they've got a while to go. So, like I said, at the same time, I don't want to downplay sort of the psychological significance of this inciting incident, but I also don't want to overplay how influential it was on the ground in terms of the real-world practical military situation.
But that was just the warm-up act. Rome now had its eyes on far greater prey: vengeance against Arminius and the perpetrators of the Varian disaster.
The Varian disaster.
The 30-year-old commander Germanicus had spent the winter months planning his next moves. This involved processing the huge number of reports from the field generated by his patrols, scouts, spies, and informants. These in turn would have been synthesized by the general and his advisors into a strategy for the campaigning season of 15 AD. Ultimately, it appears that they recognized the difficulty of taking on a united Germanic confederation. Thus, their overall strategy would revolve around dismantling that alliance in a piecemeal fashion. This would primarily be achieved by unleashing a series of lightning strikes to eliminate each tribal element one by one.
Yeah, and that's a very intelligent, sensible strategy. As we've seen, these Germanic tribes, after that initial impressive victory, are already having a hard time maintaining that coalition, maintaining that unity that they had. And once again, we'll probably be referencing Gaul many times throughout this series, but to draw a comparison back to Gaul, as I mentioned last time, maintaining these unified coalitions were extremely difficult for these sort of independent warrior tribes. They had a hard time coming together under the auspices of one tribe or one man, and so this is already a weakness that's emerging. The Romans are going to try and target that weakness. Of course, in comparison, the Romans are extremely unified. This powerful, centralized empire. It's sort of the opposite thing going on the two sides of the Rhine.
The opening move saw the 8 Roman legions split into 2 army groups. The first group would be placed under the command of Aulus Caecina Severus. His role would be to launch a diversionary attack towards Arminius and the Cherusci tribes with 4 legions, 5,000 auxiliaries, and some hastily raised levies. Meanwhile, Germanicus would take the remaining 4 legions and roughly 10,000 auxiliaries to go after the true target of the offensive, the Chatti. This was a powerful Germanic people that Tacitus describes as follows, quote, "Hardy frames, close-knit limbs, fierce countenances, and a peculiarly vigorous courage mark the tribe. For Germans, they have much intelligence and sagacity."
For Germans, they have much intelligence. Now look, if we look at Roman sources about these Germanic peoples, or really any quote-unquote barbarian peoples, which just means non-Roman peoples, we will get a pretty similar disrespect. They write about them in a rather derogatory manner. Their lack of intelligence, lack of refinement, lack of civilization. These are things we will see cropping up. But sort of the other side of that is that the Romans talk about, the fearsome warriors of these tribes. It's a very otherized way of looking at these people who, at the end of the day, were just people. But that was the Roman perspective, and like I said, that will come through in most Roman sources we read on non-Roman peoples, in this case, on these Germanic peoples.
They promote their picked men to power, and obey those whom they promote. They keep their ranks, note their opportunities, check their impulses, portion out the day, entrench themselves by night, regard fortune as doubtful, valor as an unfailing resource, and what is most unusual and only given to systemic discipline, they rely
most unusual. And so, it's interesting in the description of this group in particular, they're sort of saying, well, these guys are actually unlike your usual barbarians. They are particularly intelligent and disciplined. How strange! Which is kind of funny because you would imagine that a lot of these warrior cultures certainly had some sense of discipline. Now, it may have been a different sense of discipline than the Romans had, but that's just a difference in perspective, I suppose.
more on the general than on the army. Their whole strength is in their infantry, which in addition to its arms is laden with iron tools and provisions. While other tribes you see going to battle, the Chatti go to campaign. It would seem by this description, they were a fierce opponent well worth knocking out of the fight early on. In a head-on contest, this would have been a tall order. However, the meticulous planning by Rome's commanders, combined with their feint against the Cherusci, yielded a distinct advantage. According to our sources, Germanicus executed a rapid march into their lands, outpacing his own engineers, who were slowly building out a network of roads and bridges.
Now that's pretty impressive, to be able to outpace Roman engineers. Really, one of the most iconic aspects of Roman campaigning was the engineering. Germanicus is going so fast that even the damn engineers can't keep up, but that is fairly typical of a Roman effort like this, or at least a Roman campaign under a talented and competent general. The decisive, quick, and disciplined movement. This is very Roman in my eyes.
Such a lightning assault was apparently only possible due to a short spell of unseasonal dryness, which left the streams and marshes shallower than usual. Altogether, this meant that when Rome's iron fist came crashing down on the Chatti, it caught them completely off guard. Every living thing in the path of the Roman army was captured or slaughtered.
Yeah.
When the tribe attempted diplomacy, their envoys were either ignored or outright killed.
And this is, and we're going to see this throughout this series, this is truly the wrath of the Roman Empire. Now, we can look at Rome's dealings with non-Roman peoples, or what they might call barbarians. There is some variety. Rome, or at least the envoys of Rome, usually act in practical ways. They want to promote Roman interests. And so we see plenty of times the Roman state making alliances and treaties with non-Roman peoples. I mean, they love to have auxiliaries from outside the empire, or, alliances with tribes or states along the border with Rome. But this is an instance where I don't know if this is necessarily a practical power-building mission, though that is part of it. This is really a vengeance-based mission. This is to get back at these tribes for basically wounding Roman pride. That's what this is. And so we are seeing the full wrath and brutality of the legions in action.
Chaos fell upon the region as the invaders ravaged the land. Some tribesmen attempted to hold their ground at the fortified capital of Matium. Yet even this proud bastion fell and was burned to the ground. Who was not chained or slain ran for their lives into the forests.
Yeah, fair.
Germanicus next marched towards the Rhine, ravaging this country on his way. The Cherusci, meanwhile, had heard of the attack and attempted to come to the rescue.
And I do wonder what the attitude of some of these Roman soldiers was, because when we think about, Rome and Germania, most of the time we go to that battle, the Battle of the Teutoburg Forest, we think about that Roman fear. I wonder, for these Roman legionaries, these soldiers, were they so motivated, so angry that fear had completely disappeared? Were they just in full attack mode? Or did any of that fear and worry remain? They mentioned that a lot of the Germans fled into the forest. I wonder if due to that, this initial inciting incident, some of these Roman troops were still a little afraid to enter into those dark and dangerous Germanic forests, or if that fear was completely wiped from their mind. It's sort of an interesting thing to think about because, like I said, more broadly, that fear seems to have lasted, that psychological scar. I'm not sure how much of a role it played here. Maybe they were just too furious to think about it.
However, they had been successfully delayed by Caecina, who had marched tauntingly around their lands, demanding their attention. His job accomplished, the Roman subordinate now also pulled back to the frontier. On his way, the neighboring Marsi rose to meet the legions. In response, Caecina forced them into an open battle and utterly crushed the tribe. In short order, he accepted the absolute surrender of their commander and completed the return journey to the Rhine. The legions now regrouped. Their blitz had been an incredible success. The Chatti, once a mighty and powerful tribe, had been utterly and completely destroyed, while the Marsi and the Cherusci had been cowed.
That's all it takes.
Phase 1 of the 1580 strategy had been achieved, and it was only May. The long summer months of the campaigning season lay ahead. There was much to be done.
After a brief moment of respite, the legions were on the move again. Phase 2 of their plans involved driving a wedge between the tribal groups, which by now must have been reconsidering their options in the face of Rome's vengeful wrath.
Yeah, I'm sure. And it's crazy to think, and we're going to get to this later in the series, and honestly, this is something that I don't quite have the answer for because, I know a bit about this, but not too much. You see the ferocity with which Rome is going at these different tribes. The Chatti are, they're done for. And Rome is already going in to break up this enemy coalition. It is very reminiscent of Rome's dealings with other tribal enemies. Gaul, the example I keep using. But, what happened in Gaul or Hispania? Well, say Julius Caesar went into Gaul, he destroyed some tribes, allied with others, cowed others, and then he stayed. He conquered. He occupied the region. What I do know is that this does not end in the long term with a Roman occupation of Germania. Like I said, it will remain wild and free till the fall of the Roman Empire. And so that's something I'm going to be thinking about, and you guys should too. Why exactly does this not dovetail into a Roman occupation of the region? Why does the region not get integrated into the empire, unlike so many other regions where Rome has done the same thing?
The crack that Germanicus hoped to widen existed in the form of the pro-Roman faction of Segestes. He was a Cherusci chieftain who had butted heads with Arminius in the past, and who had even attempted to warn Varus of the betrayal at Teutoburg.
Wow.
Since the uprising, the faction of Segestes had existed in a tentative state of coexistence with the neighboring anti-Roman groups. More recently, however, the two had come to blows, as Arminius cracked down on dissent within the ranks and Germanic forces actually besieged the renegade chieftain. The Romans saw this as a perfect opportunity to show the tribes that anyone who sided with them would receive the full protection of the legions.
Okay, interesting. And so this is, once again, typical Roman activity, but it's indicative of the fact that Rome has interests beyond just vengeance. Siding with their allies, doing the typical Roman thing of, well, we have to invade to protect our allies. I just tossed my pen. That sort of shows me that Rome is also looking to build a bit of a power base, maybe establish a permanent power base. I don't know.
There was also a more personal motive for this rescue mission.
Oh.
Segestes actually harbored Thusnelda, his own daughter and the pregnant wife of Arminius. Seizing her
Oh.
would allow Germanicus to deal a deep, personal blow to the enemy commander and provide leverage against an otherwise intractable foe. Thus, the legions executed a rapid march to save their ally. A battle was held before the fort of Segestes, which ultimately ended in a Roman victory. With the siege lifted, Germanicus now beat a hasty retreat with his valuable refugees before the enemy
Wow.
could retaliate.
Yeah, those are valuable refugees slash, valuable captive prisoners. That's what they are.
Segestes and the pro-Roman allies were given a place of refuge, while Thusnelda was sent all the way to Ravenna back in Italy. She's generally lauded by Roman authors as being a fiercely brave woman whose spirit would never be conquered despite her captivity. The rescue slash hostage-taking operation
Yeah, that's a good way to phrase it. The rescue slash hostage-taking operation.
earned Germanicus the honor of being acclaimed imperator and filled the Roman world with cheers. However, it also served as a rallying cry for the Germanic tribes, many of whom now joined the cause of Arminius, who was driven into a frenzy.
Uh-oh.
But Germanicus was not one
can
to
imagine.
leave his enemies with any room to breathe, and now launched a new wave of attacks for the summer of 15 AD. In an absolutely massive campaign, Germanicus chose to split his forces into 3 major army groups, whose goal was to obliterate another major ally of Arminius.
Jeez, they are really going about this step by step. They've got a program to follow. Rome, we talk about that fearsome Roman vengeance. Sure, but it doesn't mean they're necessarily blinded by that. Or at least Germanicus isn't, and he's in charge. I think you can start to see why he was such a hero to the Roman people. He has a program that he is going through. He's approaching this very strategically. And I'm curious to see what sort of resistance Arminius and the Germans managed to put up. I mean, from someone who doesn't know the details about these campaigns, it's often seen as Germanicus sort of steamrolling over these German tribes. But, I think it seems to me that Arminius is a pretty talented fellow himself, so I am curious to see what sort of resistance they managed to put up.
The Bructeri. Caecina and Lucius Stertinius led 2 prongs of the attack by land from the south, while Germanicus led an amphibious assault from the north.
Ooh,
The carefully
an amphibious assault. Interesting, and they're going pretty far north. I don't know much about Roman exploration of this region, but I feel like Rome, especially up until this point, has not spent that much time in that northern area of Europe, especially not at sea.
choreographed pincer move completely overwhelmed the enemy. All along the river Ems, the lands were devastated, and the barbarians driven to flight.
Ooh.
Stertinius' army group gave chase as the enemy attempted to burn their own possessions in a scorched earth retreat. But after catching and slaughtering them to a man, the legionaries stumbled on an unexpected prize.
Oh.
The Eagle of the 19th Legion,
Right.
one of the 3 that had been lost at Teutoburg.
And if you want to talk about restoring Roman pride, reclaiming one of those lost eagle standards, that is probably one of the biggest steps you can take in terms of, reinforcing, restoring the lost pride of many of these Roman people. I mean, the other big step you can take is absolutely crushing those responsible. But aside from that, reclaiming those eagle standards, very, very important. I mean, those eagle standards were symbols of the legions, symbols of the Roman military, symbols of Rome as a whole. There were these objects of much adoration, that really important symbolism. And so to lose one, well, that was a great shame. But then to reclaim one, that's a great honor, and that's something that would have absolutely been celebrated.
The reclamation of this prize was an immense boost to the morale of the legions, who rejoiced in its long-awaited return.
Yeah.
Perhaps, as a result of this discovery, Germanicus decided it was finally time to lead a victorious Roman army back to the site of its previous defeat. Thus, after completing mopping up operations against the Bructeri, Germanicus consolidated the 3 army groups and marched them east to the Teutoburg forest.
Oh,
The
wow.
gravity of the situation was not lost to those who marched in the footsteps of their doomed colleagues.
I'm sure.
Tacitus describes the episode with muted tones of shock, giving voice to the hushed scene as survivors of the battle gave a grisly tour of its 6-year-old remnants.
Wow. 6-year-old remnants. It's already been that long. I think that shows you basically how influential this battle was. Walking through these hallowed grounds, I imagine would have been a very somber and moving experience. And Rome is still undergoing these campaigns of vengeance 6 years on. That visual, that timeline really gives you a good idea of how influential this whole thing was.
For much of the day, Germanicus and his army buried the skeletons of their fallen comrades in mass graves, many of which have been found by modern archaeology. The action was frowned upon by some in Rome, who believed that the ghastly sights would demoralize the army. Germanicus, however, ensured that the consecration of the dead would drive home one single purpose among the living: vengeance.
Yeah, I can see how it could go either way. You can imagine how that might be demoralizing, seeing the sight of this great Roman defeat, maybe feeling the shock, maybe a bit of that fear. But you can also imagine how it would be sort of, moralizing in maybe a bit of a stoic way. It's not like you see this and you cheer, yes, move forward, but maybe it sort of sets firm the determination in your heart to get that vengeance that you need. Now that you've seen the skeletons of your fallen comrades, now you really are determined to win more victories. So, I can understand how you could look at it from either perspective.
Vengeance against the man who had been responsible for this. The legions vowed that they would be bearing the corpse of Arminius next. Almost immediately, the entire Roman force decamped and marched against the Germanic warlord.
Alright, and this is what I'm excited to see, because I gotta be honest, I don't know how Arminius' story ends. I really don't know where we're going from here. And up until this point, Germanicus has been steamrolling these Germanic tribes. I guess we'll see if Arminius can put up more of a fight.
Their renewed fury must have been felt by Arminius, who retreated before them. However, he did so quite deliberately, waving a red flag before the enraged bull of the legions and leading them ever deeper into the pathless tracts of the forest. Eventually, the ground gave way to a clearing, at the end of which the Germanic tribes awaited. The Romans eagerly formed ranks and advanced against them, only to see the enemy once again march off into the woods. Germanicus had had enough and launched his cavalry to nip at their heels. If these could delay the rearguard long enough, his heavy infantry might be able to close the distance and finally bring them to battle.
Alright.
However, as these...
you could imagine how these Germanic soldiers would be a little more mobile than the Romans. My assumption would be less heavily armored, more familiar with the environment, therefore able to move a little bit faster. At least than the Roman infantry. Now, of course, Germanicus is going to try and use his cavalry to gain that advantage back.
These approached. Vast numbers of tribesmen emerged from concealed positions and set upon them. Many of the riders...
Classic German trap!
...were slain in a hail of slingstones, arrows, and javelins, while the remainder broke into a panicked retreat. As they thundered back across the plain, the fleeing cavalry disrupted the infantry cohorts which had been following them and infected these with panic. Arminius now surged forward, eager to devour this detachment of the Roman army as it struggled to retreat over marshy ground. Disaster was only avoided by the arrival of Germanicus and the bulk of the army. At this point, the two commanders must have locked eyes across the field in a tense moment of mutual respect. Should either of them give the command to attack, thousands would die. Ultimately, however, Arminius decided to back down.
I think I was right about Arminius. He's clearly a competent guy. Managed to lure some of the Romans into a bit of a trap, though crisis was avoided by Germanicus. That's probably the closest call we've seen throughout these campaigns of Germanicus so far, and Arminius has also been quite cautious in whether or not to engage the Romans.
The Roman army was ready and alert now, and posed too great of a threat to attack head-on. However, there was only so long that the legions could keep up the pursuit. They were weeks away from their bases on the Rhine, and winter was fast approaching. Soon, the legions would have to turn their back on Arminius and head home. Sure, they could cast glances over their shoulders, but it's in the moments when their guard was down that Arminius, the master ambusher, would strike with a dagger to the back.
No, that's exactly right. This man is always ready to ambush. And we can draw from the experience of one Julius Caesar, First off, if you want to winter in enemy territory, you better already have it pretty secured, right? Occupied for at least a while, have some control over the territory, and even then, yeah, you can expect some winter attacks, or you can expect some surprise attacks when the legions start to move again. In this kind of environment, yeah, it would be extremely dangerous to keep going during the wintertime. The Roman legions have to withdraw back over the Rhine.
Germanicus was wary of this danger and marched his unified army back to the Ems River, where they had previously destroyed the Bructeri. Here, he felt a little bit more comfortable and split the army. Germanicus would embark his men on the ships that had been used in the initial assault and return home via the northern route. Alongside them would ride his cavalry for mutual support. Stertinius would linger briefly to receive the surrender of some Germanic tribes, while Caecina moved swiftly south with 4 legions and the bulk of the remaining troops. This army group would return by way of the Long Bridges. As the name implies, it was a series of narrow causeways and...
I do think you can still see the Roman mindset, how they're approaching this. Maybe a little bit of that fear, or maybe even not fear, just caution in how, they encounter Arminius. Disaster is avoided. No engagement happens. Germanicus pulls back, and then the next move is split the army into 3. Everybody withdraw. Well, actually, one segment of the army would linger, but, a lot of the army, withdraw back to the safe zone. You can really see that Roman caution, which is absolutely fair. That caution is justified in dealing with these Germanic tribes, and Arminius in particular.
Bridges, which cut through an area of particularly marshy terrain. Such a route was an obvious strategic risk, but at the same time provided the quickest way home. Thus, Caecina decided to mitigate the window of attack by marching his men forwards with all haste. However, they could ultimately only advance as fast as the baggage animals. Arminius, meanwhile, had been keeping an eye on the splintering Roman forces and decided that now was his chance to strike.
Smart.
He rallied the tribes in pursuit of Caecina, shadowing the force and delaying their advance. At the same time, advanced units were sent ahead to outpace both armies and take up positions along the wooded hills flanking the entrance to...
Smart from Arminius. He's keeping an eye on the movements of these Roman armies. Once they retreated a little bit, maybe felt a bit more comfortable, he chose that as his time to strike. Yeah, like they said, clearly he is a master of ambush. I don't know about his military skills more broadly, though it seems like he is pretty competent, but... like a lot of this sort of Germanic-style warfare at this time, or even you think back to a lot of the tribal opponents Roman has fought, a lot of their warfare, at least against these heavily armored Roman legions, is focused around speed, surprise, and ambush.
To the Long Bridges. When the Romans finally reached the valley and saw the raised causeway stretching into the distance, they must have sighed with relief. However, their hopes would soon be dashed when scouts reported that the Long Bridges were in a poor state of disrepair. Apparently, entire sections of the decades-old infrastructure project had collapsed, washed...
Yeah, that doesn't look like a long bridge at all. That just looks like a marsh with sort of a path through it a little bit.
...away, or even been sabotaged. In light of this news, Caecina was left with a difficult choice. He could pack his bags and attempt to go the long way around. However, doing so would mean marching into the jaws of the ever-swelling ranks of their Germanic host behind him, and whatever devious ambushes Arminius had concocted along the avenues of escape.
Yeah.
Alternatively, Caecina could stick with the devil of a situation he knew here, and commit to the crossing. After all, the Romans...
Great way to describe it. The devil you know, or the devil you don't. That's basically what we're dealing with. Caecinus has been put in a dangerous situation where the 2 options available to him, neither are great. Either he goes back and, like they said, opens himself up to whatever Arminius has planned, or he keeps going forward. Maybe Arminius isn't quite as prepared to deal with that, but by crossing over this marshy, underdeveloped land where these long bridges are clearly in a state of disrepair, he also makes himself extremely vulnerable to attack.
Were master engineers who were more than capable of making the necessary repairs to reach safety. All they needed was time. The seasoned commander thus built a camp and split his forces in 2. One to carry out construction.
Okay. And he went for just about the most Roman option possible, which is form a camp, secure this location, and we'll send our engineers on to secure the path ahead. Just such typical Roman thinking. But, I mean, that Roman thinking often led to success. I'm not making fun of it. It's just funny how, yeah, that is the Roman response to this question.
And a second, to establish a perimeter of defense. This would be a life or death last stand.
Uh-oh.
Looking on, Arminius must have been pleased by the sight of the 4 legions trapped against the marshes. Their eagle standards would make fine additions to his collection.
Ooh. Yeah, they've reclaimed one. Arminius is going to try and take some others, all right? That was a great part 2. Part 2, the campaigns of Germanicus. I'm very much enjoying this series. I'm learning a lot. I'm being entertained. Like I said, this is something I know sort of the broad strokes, like a lot of Roman history, but not necessarily the specifics. And I've been excited to learn about Germanicus and why a lot of you love him so much, his accomplishments. And we'll see more of him as the series goes on. But it's really interesting to see the Roman legions in this situation. They've done a bit of steamrolling, but now they're in sort of a more risky situation. Arminius, definitely a formidable foe. I mean, a Roman-educated, Roman-trained. He was a Roman citizen, so formidable. If you guys are enjoying this series like I am, I would appreciate it if you would leave a like, subscribe, and please check out the Patreon. It is linked down below, and it will give you access to regular exclusive reaction content. Anyway, with all of that out of the way, I hope you guys are having a good day today, and I will see you all again next time. Goodbye.